Hey, what's up everybody? It's Jason. I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to a brand new album review, and today we're going to be talking about Tyler Childers' latest surprise album, Long Violent History. So first things first, if you haven't already listened to this album, let me just go ahead and try and save you some confusion by saying that this is mainly an instrumental album.
Is mayonnaise an instrument?
Out of the 9 songs on the track list, 8 of them are fiddle-led instrumentals, of course, the fiddle played by Tyler Childers, and then there's only one where there's actual vocals in it. So please, whatever you do, don't do what I did and be 3 songs deep into the album, just think to yourself, this is a long intro. But the fact that this is an instrumental album actually really makes sense because, like a lot of people, I was completely surprised when he dropped Long Violent History, especially considering Country Squire, which was his previous album, dropped in 2019, so really less than a year between those two. But then when I listened to the sound of the fiddle for like 8 songs in a row, I just kind of went, oh, this makes a lot more sense. Because I guess if it's fair to say, this could really be considered more of like a bonus album than an actual entry into his discography. Alright, so let's get to the actual music. Before this album dropped, I didn't even know Tyler Childers could play the fiddle, let alone that he was good enough to create an entire album with it. I mean, at this stage in his career, I would say that his talent as a vocalist and guitarist are pretty much unquestionable, but now we throw the fiddle into the mix and you've got a dangerous man on your hands. And in general, I guess I've just always had a greater appreciation for musicians who are talented at multiple instruments. But unfortunately, I wasn't a huge fan of this album overall. So a lot of the tracks on the first half of the album, songs like Zollie's Retreat, Send in the Clowns, and I think it's called Sludge River Stomp, those songs to me were very repetitive, and I think that's mostly due to the fact that there are a lot of phrases used on the fiddle in those songs that were repeated over and over again. And then on top of that, there were the background instrumentals, which I felt like didn't really mesh well with the sound of the fiddle sometimes. So overall, it made the song just feel unbalanced, I guess you could say. And on top of that, each of the songs that I just mentioned, they're about 4 minutes long, actually, as are most songs on the album. But with those songs in particular, I felt like if they had trimmed them down maybe by a minute or so, it really would have helped the song feel more concise and cut back on some of that repetition. The other big problem I had with this album is that those songs, and I think I'll actually throw Bonaparte's Retreat into this category as well, those songs never felt like they were building towards anything or had a really clear direction. Like we already talked about, the hook in a lot of these songs is repeated pretty often, and I guess by extension, any notes that weren't part of the main hook sounded so closely related to the hook in terms of sound that it just made you feel like you were listening to the same thing over and over again. And then by consequence, you're not really taking to new heights, like vocally, emotionally, whatever it may be. Well, certainly not vocally in this case, but you're left kind of stuck in the same zone, so to speak, throughout the entire song. But fortunately, the flip side to that con, I guess you could call it, is that each of the songs on this album kind of has its own little groove to it. Squirrel Hunter in particular comes to mind, which was actually one of my favorite songs off the album, and its selling point is that it's kind of this cool jig thing that you haven't really heard in a while. It kind of makes me feel like Rosie from Titanic in that scene where they hang out with all the ship's workers. I wonder why I didn't choose to be Jack in that scenario. But the important thing to take away is that each of the songs on this album has its own personality to it, if you will, and as a listener, I found that really refreshing. So as a whole, this album didn't really pick up for me until about the second half, and that all started with the song Midnight on the Water. I really ended up loving that song in particular because I think its power to invoke imagery was so powerful that it just made me feel like, yeah, I was on a raft in the middle of the Mississippi floating down the river, like real Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer vibes. And of course, in an album that is like 90% without vocals, I would argue that the need to invoke imagery in the listener is just, it's multiplied. And with Midnight on the Water, I think Childers was really actually able to reach those heights. The other 2 songs I really loved off the album were Camp Chase and Jenny Lind, and of course, while they were still very much like hardcore Kentucky bluegrass songs, I think the real difference between them and the songs that I didn't really like so much on the album is that the instrumentation behind the fiddle blended so much better in those 2 songs than the others. I'm not sure if it was the mixing or the production or whatever it might have been in the studio, but for some reason, those 2 songs for me, it just creates a more holistic listening experience. So it didn't feel as if any of the instruments were really fighting against each other. And the last song we have to talk about is the only song of the album with actual vocals and the title track of the album, Long Violent History. So usually whatever medium it is, whether it's movies or I guess especially music, I always try to make it a point to separate the art from the artist, which basically means that I don't want to make the assumption that whatever an artist is singing about or writing about can actually be attributed to their personality and who they are in the world. But in this case, Tyler Childers himself actually went on his YouTube channel to explain the meaning of the song Long Violent History as well as the album. And in short, he basically explained that the song Long Violent History was written as almost an emotional response to the protests erupting around our country involving Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and just the Black Lives Matter movement in general. And of course, we're not going to dive too deep into that, but the reason I bring it up is that when you listen to this song, to me at least, it's very emotionally charged, raw, And the lyrics are pretty on the nose. I'm sure even without the existence of that YouTube video explaining what the song was about, as long as you're watching the news, you can pretty much guess what this song is trying to say. And I guess I'm not really quite sure how to reconcile that. I'm not talking about the message of that song according to Childers. I'm talking about the idea that you know exactly what a song was intended to do and emotionally where the writer was at that point when they wrote it. Whenever you know the exact meaning to a song or a piece of art, it just kind of takes away, actually entirely takes away from the universality of it. You can't really enter it from your own perspective anymore if you know the perspective of the person who created it. But with that said, ultimately I was still really able to enjoy the song, not just because it was like the first time I had heard his voice in 8 songs and it just wasn't the sound of the fiddle again, but because I still was able to respect and I think appreciate the emotional vulnerability he had to write this song, perform it, and of course record it. So in the end, even though I didn't enjoy this album as a whole, I still thought there were a couple of bright spots to it. This definitely isn't going to be an album I find myself going back to often to listen to, but in the end, I'm still a huge fan of Tyler Childers, and with that, I would give this album a 6 out of 10. Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching the content. If you enjoyed it, please give a like or subscribe below. That really helps me out. Until next time, stay safe, be kind. Thank you.